So the basic way to think about this is uh, sexual activity for men and childbirth for women is going to damage the chi and the blood for sure. And then after that, it's going to affect the yang, but only if you don't have enough chi and blood. If you have sufficient chi and blood, then it just drains those things and then you're okay. If you don't have enough chi and blood, then it's going to damage the yang and maybe the yin. And that's also not that big of a deal. But if you don't have enough chi and blood or enough yin and yang to absorb the cost of childbirth, then you begin drawing on deeper reserves. So this is one of these things where we don't want to see women who are deficient going into labor. Like a woman who is anemic pre-labor, we see as a potential red flag for something like postpartum depression on the other side. So what we often focus on, and this starts at treating women for fertility, which is something that we do a lot of. If we're treating a patient for fertility, one of the things we're often doing is building up their chi and their blood. And then we want to sustain that all the way through the pregnancy. And then when they give birth, that loss, the massive expenditure of energy that they have is coming from resources that are quickly and easily replenished without tapping into deeper levels. That's the short version. There's other factors, but that's the basic. That makes sense?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the reminder about recording, guys. Okay. So other causes of internal disease, all rituals. Everything creates a movement of chi. So within a Western understanding of how the body works, we'd say like, oh, staring at active light sources triggers melatonin, alters melatonin production within the body and throws off our circadian rhythm. So don't look at screens after 8 p.m. if you have trouble sleeping, for example. That's standard advice. Within Chinese medicine, we'd say looking at something actively, using the eyes in an active manner, which is going to be true for anything that you're looking at with moving images on the screen or that's projecting light at you, is going to stimulate the liver, which is causing the yang to rise within the person. It's bringing that wood energy in, so it wakes us up. And over time, that's going to drain from both the heart and the liver, both of which are affected by damage to the blood. So not only do we see looking at a screen at midnight, and especially if it's got a lot of moving images, as something that's going to wake us up, we also see it as directly damaging the blood. The rituals include how you eat, when you eat, where you eat, kind of talked about that. Whether you eat with other people, whether you're happy when you eat, whether you're full of shame when you eat, all of these things are going to alter the movements of chi within your system and long-term create balance or imbalance. And you're not really going to learn this part systemically in school, but this is a lot of what you're going to start encountering in the clinic when patients come in and they have what appears to be a simple problem. And as you talk to them further, there's layers and layers. I had a patient for my entire year of being an intern, whose main problem was low back pain and knee pain. And he was 73 and quite out of shape, but still ran every day. And the running was clearly what was damaging his knees and his low back, but the running was also, anytime it was like, oh, maybe we should try other sports, running for him was his connection to youth and to vigor, and this whole fear of death comes up as soon as we touch on this. So as soon as you start getting into the rituals, there's always reasons of a why underneath these things. And then we usually have to look at the emotional reasons why the person engages in the ritual for there to be any change. Chinese medicine psychology is a subject. It's not one you're going to learn a ton about in school. Some of the clinical counseling courses should cover some of this, depending on who you have as a teacher. There's quite a bit in terms of Japanese traditional medicine psychology. Henry McCann has taught a class on this a couple of times. But this is what are the things that your mind fixates on? What are the places you go repeatedly? What are the subjects that you tend to return to again and again? Some patients, like if they relax and they're not engaged in anything, their mind simply goes back to the greatest hits of their successes or their failures in life. Whichever one they go to is going to change how their chi moves in their body, and it's going to change what we expect to see long-term in terms of their health. And through things like acupuncture, one of the things that I'll say when I'm working with patients who have mental and emotional issues is I'll ask them to keep a journal or to at least keep some track of what their mind goes back to. Like, what is it? Just notice and take note of the things that your mind focuses on over the next week, and let's talk about it. What are the emotions that keep occurring? What are the thought patterns that keep occurring? And then those change over time with acupuncture and with them putting their attention on it. You're not really going to learn much of this in school. If you decide to study with some of the 5-element practitioners, they will spend time on this. This is kind of a continuation. You'll see patients who they come in and every time they're talking about someone else, they're talking about how bad those people are or how annoying they are or how they always get in their way. Or they'll talk about how they're a burden on people all the time. Like, oh, my neighbor's great, but I ask her for things all the time. Just a year ago, I borrowed flour and I'm just terrible. It's like, okay, you're telling me the lens through which you're seeing the world. If all of the people you talk about, it's always a competition in the linguistic description. It's like, okay, you're telling me that your interaction with the world is coming from this place of competition. And then when your chief complaint is depression because you don't believe that you're going to be able to find a partner, these sorts of things are going to loop into that. And we can look at this from a 5-element perspective and treat them. Belief systems are one step further down. So someone who believes that people are generally trustworthy is going to have a different experience than someone who's always looking to not be conned. Often people don't see these things within themselves. I've had patients whose chief complaint is that they hate their job. And once you start talking to them about like, well, why do you hate their job? And it goes back to, well, my parents hated their job. And I was brought up to believe that you're supposed to hate your job. It's like, okay, well, we can work with this in Chinese medicine because this is all just movements of qi. Then you start getting into the much bigger questions, the epistemic questions, the questions of purpose within life. I find that a lot of patients who are coming in with, especially younger people who have been through both the recession and now this pandemic, who are really stuck with I've suddenly gotten to an age where I'm supposed to have figured some things out and I haven't, and I don't know what my purpose is in life, and I don't know why I get up in the morning. But their chief complaint is that they don't have energy and that they're depressed. But once you start poking a little bit, it's that there's nothing for them to be putting their energy towards. Within the 5-element approach, this is where we talk about the person's constitution. We talk about what it is that they innately have. I've got mixed feelings about this constitutional concept, but there is something to it. And very often what we're doing here is getting them to see, often their perceptions of the world are correct, but they're limited. So yes, this part is true, but let's start to bring you into these other things. And again, that's not done through talk therapy, that's just done through acupuncture. So as a summary, this is internal diseases, all the disease that can be produced through behavioral change without external environment being involved. These are if we can get people to alter their behaviors, all of these sources of disease change. This is what we care about the most in terms of Chinese medicine disease theory, and you're going to be learning this consistently over the next couple of years. And all of this is where disease prevention occurs as well, and that's what we're the best at doing. So there's plenty of patients I have where at 30, you can see the seeds of diabetes at 45, the seeds of chronic low back pain 10 years down the line, simply due to their diet, their exercise, and their belief system. And if we can alter those things very early, then they don't have to go through that. That makes sense to everybody? Any questions about that?
Mm-hmm. I have a question about the second to last slide you just showed. Like the ones who come in and they're questioning like their purpose. Are you getting into an answer, or are you just sorting out what their question is and then you're treating with acupuncture? Like I'm not.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly individual, but my basic rubric for this, and this is something I specialize in to some degree, is let's get them to clarify the problem. And once the problem is clarified for that week, we put in acupuncture needles. I'm not suggesting solutions. I'm not counseling. I'm not stepping outside of my scope of practice. But my job is often to say to them, like, okay, so you're tired, why? And then going down a little bit of a rabbit hole until they get to a place where they're like, yeah, I'm kind of stuck here. It's like, okay, great, let's hop on the table. And then often what I find, I mean, this is a little bit of a tangent. What I find, one of the things I love about acupuncture is that the patient kind of does it themselves. That you put the needles into their body, but then you leave the room and they have that experience in this little closed space, whatever that experience is. And then whatever changes have occurred for them, I think they get to keep it on a different level, that they get to, they earn it to a certain degree. Like there's nothing if someone twists their ankle, I can fix that. If someone's chronically depressed, I can't fix that, but the two of us working together might be able to. And so I think there's a way that this process is empowering that a lot of other modalities are not, because I'm not there. They're doing it on their own. Sorry, I'm going off a little bit there. I think giving people answers doesn't help a lot, because I have answers for me. I don't necessarily have answers for them. So I might suggest something like, it sounds like there's an issue around purpose here. I don't have the ability to give you purpose, but if you had something that you were passionate about, that you cared about, then some of these other things would pale in their importance. I don't know what it is that you need, but it seems like that is in alignment with what you're talking about. There's a lot of patient relationship building first, and it really is unique with each different person, but that's kind of the basics of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I've had that experience myself.
Okay.
But I mean, with the part where I'm not getting the answer from the acupuncturist,
Yeah.
but that it helps you on your own journey, I guess, to go and find it afterwards. And so I just didn't know if like that slide you were talking about was to actually, like, how far do you get into it? But I understand what you mean.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's, and some people are, look, if your goal is to do orthopedics or facial acupuncture, some of this stuff isn't going to be very important, but you should know the concepts, because oftentimes people change their specialties a few times. And at least currently, there aren't a lot of modalities that are super good at this, that are also quite expensive and take multiple years. And we tend to be pretty fast.
Peter, I have a question.
Shoot.
Could you elaborate a little bit on like the difference between a 5-element practitioner and TCM? Because you keep kind of like mentioning that. And
Sure.
so I'm kind of
Yeah,
wondering like exactly what that means. Is it just the perspective, like the lens that they're coming from?
Sure. So Chinese medicine is made up of many different schools of thought. There are many different ways to do Chinese medicine. All of Chinese medicine at the end of the day, I think this was in like my first week of slides, all Chinese medicine at the end of the day comes back to yin and yang, 5 phases, 8 directions, Huangdi Neijing, and a few other books. Like everyone agrees on all of that. But then where people place their focus, their emphasis, where they see within their practice or perhaps within their cultural milieu, where they see problems arising, changes where would they focus. So we had, you should have learned some of this in your foundations class or fundamentals. There was the Earth school of treating, where they're like, look, yeah, we have the 5 phases, but Earth is the most important one, so we're going to focus on that. And there was another school of thought that said the same thing, but about water, about the kidneys. Like, we're going to focus there. When you get into herbal medicine, there's a whole school of thought called the Huoshenpai, the Fire Sage School of Herbology. Every patient gets Fuzi or Rogui. They get other things too, but every patient gets those. Whereas in standard TCM herbology, you almost never use either of those. TCM itself is one perspective. TCM is not actually a particularly broad perspective either. It's just the most contemporary. It represents Chinese medicine going through a metal period where much of it was removed to standardize it and make it quickly teachable, which has happened multiple times through the history of Chinese medicine. So when I say 5-element Chinese medicine, I'm referring specifically to the Worsley tradition of Chinese medicine. There's and the Sino tradition. I think that's the other guy, where they kind of developed a Chinese medicine psychology / constitutional way of looking at things that's still taught and still really common. When you go to conferences, when you interact with the Chinese medicine community as a whole, less so in New York, more so in Boston, you're going to find a lot of 5-element practitioners. And there's running jokes about this, and of like, a TCM practitioner can usually get rid of something like menstrual cramps or back pain in a treatment or two. A 5-element practitioner can get rid of your back pain, but first we're going to have to deal with your childhood trauma. They kind of focus as deep into the root as they can. And we're going to talk today and next week a little bit about how root and branch can be conceptualized and where to put your energy. I'd compare it a little bit to, in the chiropractic world, there are chiropractors like NUCA chiropractors, where they almost exclusively focus on the top vertebrae. Like if we get that right, everything falls into place. Is oversimplification, but that's the basic idea. Within Chinese medicine, the 5-element people kind of think like, well, if we work at the deepest possible level, then other things will flower out from that. And all other change is not real. All other change is superficial. I'm putting some words in their mouth here, but that's the basic idea. Yeah, so it's just another school of thought. And I mention it because it's relatively common within this region. So you will encounter people from that school. I'm not going to talk very much about like Japanese meridian therapy because you're not going to spend much time encountering those practitioners.
Okay, thank you. I don't know why I didn't really take that away from my foundations class, so thank you for explaining that.
Marianne Funmayor does a lot of 5-element stuff. So she's a good person to ask, like, hey, what's up with 5-element thinking? She used to teach classes outside of the school in her own space on that subject. Yeah, hope that helps. Yeah, just one quick side note about that. It's important to realize that the TCM approach really is just a approach. And most of the people who are quite successful at Chinese medicine do at the very least TCM and something else. So by the time you're done with school, I would recommend picking up something else as well. To all of you, not just Kendrick. Okay, miscellaneous causes of disease. So miscellaneous causes of disease, couple ways to define it. I mentioned act of God earlier, bad luck, basically. But with internal medical causes of disease, often we have that nucleating, that initial incident of like, let's say, I've mentioned it before and it's early, so I don't have a lot of new metaphors at hand. Person has childhood trauma, they develop a pattern, and over time we can chart that childhood trauma like all the way to heart disease at 40. And if we can interrupt that process anywhere, then that's our job in terms of the preventative medicine side. The miscellaneous causes of disease are different. This is something like getting hit by a car where there's no long thread. There's an incident and then there's the fallout of the incident, and that's it. So miscellaneous causes of disease can result in internal causes of disease. So someone, for example, who gets hit by a car and then afterwards develops some sort of post-shock, post-traumatic response from that. Now we're dealing with an internal medical issue, an internal causes of disease that has arisen from the miscellaneous one, but they're a little bit separate. So the miscellaneous causes of disease are the things you can't control. So that's, I see it as your constitution. So this includes all genetic disorders, to a person's height, to their weight, to potentially some mental and emotional disorders that might arise out of their constitution. This doesn't mean we can't treat them. It just means you can't prevent the things that the person was born with. Some debate about that. Trauma, poisoning, bug bites, drugs, mistreatment. We're going to go through each of these here really quickly. So before we go into it though, the miscellaneous causes of disease is one of the categories where you should have them talk to a doctor. If your patient comes in and they're depressed, you should use your clinical experience to know whether or not they're at, like, let's say, a suicide risk, a risk of harming themselves or others, and you need to have people on your team or people within your network to refer out to. within this miscellaneous causes of disease category, especially because we're talking about things like poisoning or long-term reactions to being bit by insects, you should have them talk to a doctor. Like, we're not specialists enough in this to necessarily be able to recognize red flags when they show up. So just like cover both your ass and be a good practitioner and talk to a doctor. So don't take anything out of that to say as saying we should be treating this. This is just important to understand theoretically. And sometimes people will have seen doctors and they still have symptoms that linger, and then they come to us and we can actually be of a lot of help. So constitution, we're born with our prenatal chi set in stone. There's some debate about what we can do to alter this. One of the ideas is that through treating the parents prior to conception and during pregnancy, we can alter the constitution of the child being born. There's points and rituals that are done to do things. There's the beautiful baby point. There's a whole system of needling with golden needles, actually covered in gold needles, to help tonify the baby. If the mother's healthy, the baby's going to be healthier. That seems pretty straightforward to me. I don't know how much we can actually directly affect the fetus through needling, but that's not really something I've had enough experience with to have an opinion about. I do know that a mother who has chronic diarrhea for her entire pregnancy and is not producing postnatal chi is not going to be able to give the chi that she would hope to be able to give to the fetus. So often we can prevent some of these things simply through having the mother be healthy. Way back in the day, this was one of the jobs of matchmakers. Actually, both in China and in India, the job of the matchmaker was to try to see the constitution of these two people before it had fully formed. So let's say taking people in their early teenage years and being able to see from their constitution what they're likely to be like in the future, and then pairing them up with someone complementary. Again, whether this was something they were successful at or not, I don't really have a strong opinion about. But in theory, this is what they were supposed to be doing. Same for a lot of the systems that we use today, where we're trying to put people on, there are plenty of countries where your professional track is largely set by the time you're 12. And they're using ways of attempting to recognize what you will have aptitude for at that young age. It's the same sort of constitutional typing in a lot of ways. And this comes from the parents, and it comes from heaven, which in this case is, let's just say, kind of like the source of all the yang. So we're not just saying that the baby is a combination of the mother and the father. The idea is that it's a combination of the two parents plus a little something extra that it has been defined differently over history, from an astrological cause to luck to familial karma, more or less, a whole bunch of different ways. This book is really useful. Again, I don't have super strong feelings about whether it's accurate or not, but a very strange feature of humans is that we have a specialized area of our brain for recognizing faces. It memorizes and stores faces. People can get aphasia, atraxia. There's a word for it when you lose the ability to recognize faces. And so you have to recognize your friend by like, okay, I know that's my friend because they have this mole here and this mole here. So that's what their face looks like. Turns out we're kind of face blind in terms of conscious awareness. Learning how to read people's faces in a Chinese medicine system helps us to see through that blindness and notice a lot of details about our patients that we hadn't noticed before. Lillian Bridges is also a fairly entertaining author. She has a whole lecture series that she does around the US. If you want to go into anything related to cosmetic acupuncture, this stuff is absolutely mandatory. And it's also kind of fun. So I would recommend that book for learning more about how to read people's constitutions. Trauma is the next miscellaneous cause. So this is physical and emotional trauma. We're good at this. The short version of this is injury causes chi and blood stagnation, and it can also cause shock. We treat these as branches because there is no root in this case. The root of, let's say, the car impact doesn't have to be addressed. All we're doing is treating the fallout because the original cause is gone. This is what you do if you do orthopedics. We use all of our tools. E-stim using electrical currents is very helpful for this. Our topical herbs are phenomenal. I've had people completely heal large fractures in a third of the time that they were given as a predictive time frame from an MD using topical herbs and internal herbs. We do all sorts of interesting types of massage. Bone setting is a big part of Chinese medicine history. You're not going to learn much about Tui Na or bone setting while in school, but plenty of people go on to study those things afterwards. We're great at trauma. And of course, anyone with a serious injury should probably go see a doctor before they come to see you. But after they see the doctor, we can speed up their healing. This is a great starter book on treating injuries. It's fairly short, it's readable. I've given this to patients who are interested in treating their own injuries. You can be a layman and read this. I developed an entire 3-hour Chinese emergency medicine seminar on this, along with an herb kit that people could purchase back when I was in Canada. It's all in here. Tom Bizio is great. He and Frank Butler together created the Zhenggu Tui Na program here in New York, which is an Tui Na and bone setting 2-year program. There's a whole series of products for sale at Camwo. That's their product line. I'd recommend picking this up. It's cheap. It's not a textbook. It's just a little paperback. And at least the vast majority of it works very well. Poisoning is more challenging. So I've attempted to I had a patient who did art restoration work for a while, who ended up with heavy metal poisoning from using, well, paints that had heavy metals. And I wasn't able to get much success with working with her. There are some interesting people within our field who work in this, but it's certainly a specialty and it's more challenging. Some aspects of possession show up here that we're going to talk about towards the end of the semester. We've got anti-parasite herbs, but in general, you want to send them to a Western medical practitioner. Most of our herbs that treat parasites tend to have some systemic damage that comes with them. So often it's nice if in referring them to a tropical medicine specialist, which is the group of doctors that most works with parasites, if they can find a specific antihelmintic drug that can target the exact problem, that tends to beat out what we can do. But some patients have parasites and then have weird symptoms that persist for years afterwards, that the parasites are gone, but they have this sequelae, this continuing issue. We're good at treating that. So oftentimes this is something we work in tandem with practitioners for. And I'm going to say then that's different from bites from animals. So spider, tick, snake, cat, all sorts of different animal bites can cause extended problems. Again, this is a situation where they should go talk to an MD first. But if they have lingering issues, often there's not a lot that can be done within the Western medical approach. So we tend to come in and help there. I think, as far as I can tell, I mean, I haven't looked into this in the past year or so, but I don't think a lot's changed. We're kind of at the forefront of treating whatever the hell chronic Lyme disease is. Within the Western medical establishment, there's still argument about what we're talking about when we talk about chronic Lyme disease, but there's more and more of a consensus that some people who get Lyme have lingering problems and we don't know why. So there's a lot of theories, there's a lot of strong opinions. We seem to be doing a pretty good job of treating this. And there aren't a lot of people who seem to be doing a good job of treating this. So that's, for anyone who's interested in this, you could build an entire practice doing only chronic Lyme treatments and be very successful.
Is that treatment just like an ongoing treatment for the person?
So you're not going to learn this in school. This would be a specialization you would do after school. There are multiple different approaches. They're usually, I've seen anything from about 6 months to 2 years of fairly consistent herbal treatment for this being the main way to do it. There's a woman, so the two people I can think of who are doing the most work about this are Heiner Fruhoff and, oh, what's her name? I went to a talk she did about a year ago. Hillary, one second, let me pull this up. Yeah, that's what it was. Hillary Thing is her name. And she's a Lyme specialist out of Connecticut. So she's local. Heiner Fruhoff's on the West Coast, where there's still plenty of Lyme disease now. So either of them, they both do entire training programs on how to do this and are having good success, or at least a bit of success, which is much better than what else is available right now. And we're going to talk a little bit about what Heiner-Fruehauf does when we talk about goose syndrome later in the semester. Another cause of miscellaneous disease is drugs. So when I say drugs, this is everything from prescription drugs to over-the-counter drugs to supplements to recreational drugs. So all of them are going to have a movement of pee, all of them are going to have temperatures, all of them are going to affect organs. Most vitamin and mineral supplements are cold in nature. So oftentimes you'll see people who take a ton of supplements developing some digestive issues simply from too much cold being put into their spleen and stomach. Seems minor, but you add up a couple pills taken every day for 10 years and you get a compounding effect. Generally speaking, don't treat people who are impaired by recreational drugs. That being said, we've got treatments to sober people up very quickly. And while it causes the patients to vomit a lot, it works just with acupuncture. But yeah, don't treat impaired patients. I think we're getting to the end here. So I'm just gonna go through this and then we'll take a break afterwards. Almost there. Mistreatment is a huge category. This is, someone's gonna have to write a book on this in the next few years. I'm pretty sure there are a couple already in the works. If you look at the Shanghan Lun, which is our kind of our first major herbal text, about 2/3 of the book is about how to fix patients who got sick and then were inappropriately treated. So we've got all these natural ways that the organs interact. We've got the controlling and generating cycle within the 5 elements. We have a knowable list of things that can happen when a person gets sick. If they're treated incorrectly, excuse me, we can have unnatural things happen. And that makes this an entire category of disease in and of itself, really. So a patient who has a pathogen in the lungs that's either going to be venting out or it's going to be penetrating deeper and affecting the large intestine, if they're given the wrong set of herbs, it might get trapped in the lungs and develop into a chronic condition. So if we want to treat it, we're going to have to figure out that mistreatment occurred. It's a challenging thing, and often these are the cases that drive us a little bit crazy because they just don't make sense until you hear that, well, yeah, I mean, I did do this, this, and this to help treat it, and it did get a lot worse after that. We've got a number of treatments that are kind of like reset treatments to help even out any historical mistreatment, but ideally they just don't get mistreated in the first place.
Peter?
So yeah, go ahead.
Would this be a result of lack of experience by the practitioner or difference of the practice philosophies?
This would be, I mean, it can be from a lot of different things. I wouldn't say it's from a difference in practice philosophies. There's definitely a challenge. So 2 different acupuncturists coming from different traditions might take different routes to get the patient to health. So I might focus more on the mental emotional side. Someone else might focus more on the accumulation of pathogens within the patient. But if we're left to our own devices, we might get to that same endpoint together. In the same way that, like, there are a lot of wrong ways to make curry, but there's no right way to make curry. There's a bunch of different right ways to make it. And then there's a bunch of ways that are just incorrect. And so these are errors made by a practitioner. Whether that's due to ignorance on their part or ineptitude, it depends on the person. This is one of the reasons why a lot of the things that, in general, what you're going to see when you're in the clinic at the school are fairly superficial treatments. I would recommend you push your supervisors to encourage you to give deeper treatments so you learn how to do them. But in part, it's because if you're giving relatively superficial treatments, you don't have to worry about mistreatment because you're not working that deeply. On the other hand, Jeffrey Yuen, for example, has a whole series of like divergent treatments and extraordinary vessel treatments that, when done improperly, I've seen people get very strongly affected by them. Yeah, and can cause problems, can cause damage.
Is that involving herbs specifically with the needle, or it could just be needles too?
You can do that with just the needles, but I wouldn't. You're not going to make that error because that requires fairly specific things to be done. I wouldn't be concerned about hurting yourself or other people in school while being supervised when you're practicing and working in the clinic. Though I mean, all of you are going to develop weird aches and pains and headaches at various different times during the needle tech classes, but that's just comes with the territory. But none of you are going to get permanently ill from it. So there's a whole bunch of stuff in the miscellaneous causes of disease. And we can see some of Chinese medicine's blind spots here. Like we're just not very good at parasites, as far as I can tell. There might be aspects of Chinese medicine that are great at parasites. I just haven't been exposed to them. That's totally possible. And it's a nice reminder of, like, I said this, I think in week 2, I'm gonna repeat it here. Chinese medicine and Western medicine are complementary in that they're good at different things. And a lot of the miscellaneous causes of disease, you send them to the person who specializes, and that person is a Western medical practitioner. And then we deal with the aftermath of it. So, we have herbs that treat appendicitis with a decently high success rate. But if they don't work, the patient dies. So send them to the hospital where they're almost certainly not going to die. Yeah, it's helpful to learn about these things even if we don't use them, but don't use them. All right, and that's really all the causes of disease. We've covered them all within Chinese medicine. Nothing about bacteria, nothing about viruses, because we just don't think that way. And hopefully as we go more through the semester, we'll be able to point to some things where it's like, yes, this is overlapping with this viral condition, or this bacterial condition. Any questions before we take a break?
Yes, could you expand a little more about on viruses and bacteria, how Chinese medicine looks at it?
Well, we don't have germ theory in Chinese medicine, so we don't think about it. I understand that that's going to cause headaches for some people. I'm comfortable talking about bacteria and viruses with my patients because that's the language they're using. But if you begin thinking about bacteria and viruses within Chinese medicine, it doesn't really work.
So what's the perception of coronavirus then in Chinese medicine?
It's a damp heat epidemic pathogen. So damp heat, what's the word? Yeah, I think it's still just epidemic pathogen in the translation. There's a whole system of thinking for that largely comes from the Wenbing tradition, the wind heat school of thought, for diseases that are highly contagious. And we see them as being transmitted through the air. Like all of the description sounds like a virus, but there's no microscope. We're not looking at it. We're not treating it directly in that sort of a way. So we have a different model for thinking about it, where the actual molecular structure of what's going on isn't really what we care about. Right. In the same way that, like, if you look in Bensky at the end, or John Chen's work to go further with it, you can see the major chemical constituents within the herbs. I don't know any of those. They don't. Within the way I practice herbology, it doesn't matter. For some people it does, and that's great, but Chinese medicine doesn't rely on that understanding to work. And actually a lot of people who attempt to understand Chinese medicine through a biomedical lens have a lot of trouble practicing. I also understand that that's very frustrating, especially when you're taking anatomy and physiology or biochemistry at the same time and learning this other side and then being told, like, yeah, but they don't really integrate. It can be frustrating, but I'd recommend just take it a little bit on faith for now, and down the road, you won't have to take it on faith. It will make more sense.
And another question, have you had anyone coming into you personally in order to, for the purpose of treating in prevention to coronavirus?
Well, I'm certainly not seeing anyone who has the coronavirus. I mean, we have a sign on the front door of the clinic that says basically, like, if you feel sick, don't come in, call your practitioner, etc. That being said, I've seen, let me think.
So like immune system.
I've stocked herbs to aid in prevention. So if things start getting worse again in New York, like they look like they might be, I might start giving out preventative herbs to all of my patients. I also have herbs stocked for treating the aftermath of corona. Like there's plenty of stories of people that get corona and then a month later, there's still something wrong. I've treated that quite a few times already, successfully. You know, someone who comes in and like, excuse me, their cardiovascular health is just poor. Like after corona, I could walk up one flight of stairs and I'm out of breath. It's like, okay, well, we can work with that. We can get that going again, even just through acupuncture. But yeah, there are a number of herbal formulas that have like tripled in price because they're good for the treatment of corona once it happens and for treating the fallout afterwards. And we got a whole series of formulas that were getting used in China for like, oh, if someone gets corona, here's what you give them. Here's what is being done in China to keep them from ending up on a ventilator. Keep lung functionality good. So all of those things are present. And some of the TCM stuff is thought about in terms of viruses and bacteria in China at this point, but that's not really how we do it over here now. Yeah. And that's not to say Chinese medicine also doesn't have a problem with saying like, oh yeah, that's a viral condition. That's just not how we talk about it. Like, it's not like, no, viruses don't exist. It's that thinking about viruses doesn't get us to a solution in Chinese medicine.
Yeah. I have a question that kind of adds on to that.
Sure.
So it's like, even if we don't think about viruses or bacteria being like the cause of something, do the things that we do for treatment like help clear bacterial and viral infections, right? Like, I mean, do some of the herbs and stuff have like antibiotic properties?
Oh yeah. Oh, 100%. I mean, and we know that. We can look at the chemical constituents and know that. I mean, like the newest, most popular anti-malaria drugs recently, like 15 years ago, came from Chinese herbs that have been used for 2,000 years to treat malaria. Like the pharmaceutical industry is still mining Chinese herbs for functional antibiotics and things like that. And we've got formulas that are amazing antibiotic formulas. But yeah, it's just not how we think about it. Part of that, I think, and after this question, we'll take a break and we can take more questions afterwards. I don't want to keep people too long here. One of the ways that I see this is sometimes we're using techniques that are called attacking and purging techniques, which is where we're trying to kill the bacteria and viruses. Sometimes we're using treatments where we're doing something like tonifying the earth, which I would compare more to changing the person's substrate so that the bacteria can't happily grow there anymore. So like if the person is vulnerable to an infection due to the condition of, let's say, their skin or their lungs or their stomach or their sinuses, sometimes there's things we can do that alter the ground, the terrain within the person's system, and then the bacteria resolves on its own. It's like most people heal from most things without an intervention. So when someone comes in and they've got something that normally people heal from, one of the ways to approach it is to just go kill the thing for the person. And another is to figure out why their body didn't kill it in the first place and help to resolve the reason they didn't kill it. And then they kill it themselves. That makes sense? So sometimes we're treating bacteria and viruses without touching the bacteria or the virus, but we just don't think about it really in that way. That helpful? Okay. Let's do a 10-minute break, guys. It's 10:12. Please come back at 10:22 and we will continue. And I'm happy to take some more questions and then we'll go into some new material. Have a good break. Okay, welcome back, everybody. Just wrapped up some private messages there. Yeah, feel free to follow up on any of those if there's more things in either email or on the Slack. All right, so we're going into finish with the miscellaneous causes. So next we've got emergence and propagation of disease. Yeah. Anyone have any questions before we go into the next part? Oh, okay, good. So I'll just toss these up again here in the chat if anyone needs them, and we'll go right in. Still recording, okay. Okay. So we're starting to ground down this information a little bit more. Now that we've gone through all of the external, internal, and miscellaneous causes of disease, we get to talk about how disease actually happens. So, you know, we've said like, oh, emotions can cause disease, and you know, anger can cause the chi to rise, but that doesn't get us all the way to what is the problem. Certainly some people can get angry and it doesn't cause an issue, and other people get angry and it does. So why is that? We've talked about all these different factors that are present at the same time. So, you know, one person can go running for 5 miles every day and it isn't an issue, and another person goes running for 5 miles a day and a week later they can barely walk because their knees are messed up. So what is it that's causing these differences between these people? And we're going to start touching on that here. This is supposed to be the beginning of class. So we're about an hour behind, but that's all good. I have it planned into our schedule that we're going to fall behind. I find that to be, I think time for questions is really important. Okay. So this is what we're going to be talking about to start off. We need to talk about chi production. So this chart should be familiar to all of you, both from week 1 of this class and from last semester. Chi is produced by the spleen and the lungs working together. Original chi, yuan chi, coming up from the kidneys, meeting in the chest, and producing nutritive and defensive chi. This might be the sort of thing on some exam that I want you to say, fill in all of those boxes. Just putting that out there. Or draw this from scratch. I don't really know how I make you do that on a computer, but we used to do that in class on paper. So if someone has chi deficiency, right place here? Yeah, okay, good. If someone has chi deficiency, it can come from a number of different places. It can come from spleen, from what they eat, right? So anytime we say spleen, you want to, in part in your head, translate that into digestion. It can come from the spleen, come from the lungs, their breathing and their ability to exchange when they breathe, or from their kidneys, from which would be, again, this part right here, the original chi coming up. And it can also just be from other lifestyle factors, right? That are affecting consumption. So we can say spleen, lung, or kidneys, but we could also say someone who's overthinking too much and therefore damaging their spleen indirectly, or the choice of foods that they eat. So you can get chi deficiency because you're not producing enough, and here are the reasons why you might not produce enough, or you can be consuming too much. You can have a pathogen inside of your system that itself damages your chi, or you can have behaviors in your lifestyle that drain the chi faster than you fill it. So someone who's an Olympic level athlete is going to need to produce a ton of chi because they're going to consume a ton of qi. I had a friend who was a rower who did crew at UC Berkeley on their varsity team. He was eating 12,000 calories a day. His breakfast consisted of 2.5 pounds of hash browns, a pound of bacon, and about 8 eggs every day. And if he didn't eat that much, he started losing weight because he exercised that much. So we have to balance out. I mean, and that's not just qi, that's going to be blood and yin and yang, but we have to balance out production with consumption. You produce much more than you need and you're not storing it effectively. People tend to accumulate dampness or stagnation. If you consume more than you produce, you tend to have low energy. That fits. We'll go into this a little.
The rower?
Mm-hmm.
A rower?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, crew at a fairly high level is one of the most energy intensive sports we have. Okay, so not enough production. Oh, I just basically said all of this. So yeah, the spleen and stomach make the food, the guqi, the lungs make the dachi, and the yuan qi comes from the kidneys. Part of the lifestyle can be the air that you're in, right? So if people right now in California are finding themselves to be low energy with all of the forest fires going on, part of that might be because they're no longer making qi from the air in the way that they used to. So that affects the entire thing. Then when we see that they're qi deficient, we don't have to start asking about like, well, what is it that you're doing differently? The air is literally different. So yeah, you're not going to be producing as much qi in that sort of a way. Yeah, I'll spend 2 minutes on this. So things like forest fires represent one of the places, this is a complete aside and tangent, represent one of the places that we can do good preventative medicine. At this point, if you're working on the West Coast, Pacific Northwest, down to San Francisco, basically, you know that fire season comes every year. You know that people are going to get irritation in their lungs from it. We have herbal formulas that increase production of surfactant in the lungs, that nourish the fluid in the yin of the lungs, and therefore work as preventative medicine for the forest fires. This is now something common that acupuncturists and herbalists out there are doing. In June, they start putting all of their patients who have had problems with their lungs with forest fires in the past on herbal formulas to prevent issues once the fires start. This is one of the places where we can look at it and go, we know this is coming. How about we start doing preventative medicine? And that can often be both very lucrative and very helpful for the community. So we're just going to go a little bit deeper into how this qi is produced, because this is mandatory to understand before we get to qi fighting against pathogens. So without the spleen and stomach, food doesn't do anything. There's a focus within Western nutrition on what chemical constituents are in the food that you're eating, what at a molecular level is happening there. In Chinese medicine, we care about what's in the food, but as much, if not more, we care about what you can get out of the food. So very often people are supplementing within the Western tradition, and in the Chinese medicine, we just see them as buying expensive urine and feces. Because if you take it in, that doesn't mean you get it. And Chinese medicine, we focus very heavily on the ability of the stomach and the spleen to extract as much from the food as possible. And that's not, outside of digestive enzymes, that's not really a concept within Western medicine, within Western nutrition. Sorry, I'm being attacked by my cat. Okay. So the stomach rots and ripens, spleen transforms and transports. We're going to talk about those in more detail when we get to each organ in the second half of the semester. Just a reminder, we're not talking about the Western medicine spleen. We're talking about that which transforms and transports within the body. And if we don't rot and ripen the food and transform and transport the food, we have undigested food. So one of the symptoms of spleen and stomach deficiency, for example, is undigested food in your stool. And of course, if the food isn't digested, you didn't get much out of it. And if you do, and if you have undigested food in your stool, you're not producing guqi, you're not producing qi at all. Similarly, for the lungs, we extract the dachi, which translates basically as the big qi, from the air that we breathe. We don't focus nearly as much on the lungs as we do on the spleen and stomach, in part because the lungs are fairly polar. They either work or they don't, basically. And if they don't work, we have a big problem. If they don't do their job well, there's a bit we can do. But with the spleen and stomach, there's a lot of wiggle room. But at the end of the day, our patients who come in with asthma, who come in with bronchitis, any sort of obstructive lung issue, they're going to very frequently be qi deficient. The issues that we see arising from asthma in the person's system tend to be qi deficiency issues, because as long as they're not able to breathe well, they're not going to be able to produce qi well. Okay. And then the last one is the kidneys, right? So we don't really think of the kidneys in general with postnatal qi production because it's not involved with air and food, but there's this like important last little step where your body has to use energy to produce energy. We have to utilize qi that exists to produce qi. This is one of the places that we see a lot of treatments for things like chronic fatigue syndrome not working because the person is so qi deficient that they don't have enough qi to produce qi. And we'll supplement that with herbs and with a lot of moxa. And the kidneys, resting under everything else, if they're weak enough, then they don't send that little spark up. And we end up with congestion in the chest because we produce this gathering qi, but we don't make this next step if the kidneys are sufficiently weak. But this tends to really only show up in people who are elderly or who have been aged prematurely by behavior.
How would you tonify the kidneys in that case?
In this case, we would not tonify the kidneys. We would supplement other things to just try to get the postnatal qi working, production working. So we'd actually, more than supplement the kidneys, we'd try to substitute acupuncture and moxa to make this piece of the chain work. And then once they're producing qi, we'd start trying to direct that down to the kidneys, almost as like storage. So this is, it's happened to me a handful of times now, and I've heard about it from quite a few practitioners as well. It's a common occurrence. Women going through early menopause who start getting acupuncture and herbal treatments and begin getting their period again regularly. Menopause somewhat reversing when it's shown up unnaturally early because we're able to resupplement the kidneys. But we do this through reestablishing proper production of qi. Yeah. We can't extract qi when there's no qi in the air or the food. So this is one of the issues that we run into with poor quality food. It can have all the vitamins and minerals that it wants, but if we can't get it out, it doesn't really matter. And a lot of the food that people eat just doesn't have a lot of qi to get in the first place. Or the qi involves an excessive amount of work to get. And again, we're not necessarily looking at the molecular constitution. When we look at this within Chinese medicine, things like freshness are very important. And within Western nutrition, we can see that there are all sorts of compounds that break down quickly after, say, harvesting of a fruit or a vegetable. I thought I hated, brain fart again. That Central American fruit, it's quite large, that has black seeds in the middle, that's orange.
Papaya.
Papaya. I thought I hated papaya forever because in general, when you eat papaya in the US, it has a mildly like stomach acidy flavor, like bile-like flavor. That's not true if it's fresh. Papaya has one of the highest amounts of digestive enzymes present. And if you don't eat it within a day or two of harvesting it, it begins eating itself and actually turning into basically stomach acid. So we care a lot within Chinese medicine about things like how fresh the food is. And within Western medicine, within Western nutrition, that's cared about, but it's secondary to a lot of other things. Maggie asks, do you have recommendations for texts on Chinese medicine nutrition? The nutrition class happens so late in our curriculum. It does kind of happen late in the curriculum. I would say don't think about that until you're done with the first year, because this is going to the first year lays all of the language down so that you can learn stuff way faster and at a deeper level afterwards. I can't really think of many good texts on Chinese nutrition. There's a good starter text. I hate the name of it, but it's a good starter text. It's written by, I have not been to his website before. Oh no. Okay. It's called The Asian Diet. Again, I don't like the name. It's written by a guy named Jason Bussell, who's fairly high up in the acupuncture world in Chicago. It's a great starter text. When I was writing my nutrition class, he sent me a free copy of this. But the reality is we need new and better books on Chinese medicine nutrition. Everyone buys Healing with Whole Foods. I'm convinced nobody reads it. And the author needed a stricter editor, let's say. There's good stuff in there, but it could lose 300 pages. Ancient Wisdom, Modern Kitchen is a great book with recipes. Okay, great. Yeah. Yeah, I'd have to check it out. One of the things that you want is a thorough description of the energetics of each of the foods that looks almost like an herbal text. So you want to know the flavors, the channels, approximate dosage, and it shows up a little bit differently. But Adrian, thanks for the recommendation. We'll look into that too. So for food, rotting, ripening, transforming, transporting, all of these things require energy. So it's like we get this input of raw ingredients and our body has to use energy we already have to convert that into things that are us. So people who are very deficient need easy to break down foods. This is often the opposite of what we're doing within Western nutrition, where if we have a very weak patient, often we're starting them on things like broth and rice and congee. And we might look at them and say, yes, they need really rich and nourishing foods, but that doesn't mean they're capable of digesting that. So things like rice and broth are considered easy, and then things like ice cream or vegetable and fruit juices are considered quite hard to digest. The fruit juices because of the density of what's in them. Basic rule of thumb for juicing is never, within Chinese medicine, is don't drink more juice than you would eat of the raw plant itself. So when people are eating 3 beets, 4 apples, an entire head of celery for breakfast every day in juice form, we see that as really out of balance because you would never eat that much food raw. And then that tends to burden the spleen and stomach, and then people end up deficient who don't have to be. So you end up with problems if you consume foods that don't have enough qi to extract, so very low quality foods, foods that are hard to digest, quite a bit of dairy, ice cream, cold foods, excessively rich foods, or foods that are all of the same nature. So someone who only eats spicy food, the person who walks, your patient who comes in who carries hot sauce in their bag with them and puts it on everything they eat, over time, that's going to cause some sorts of imbalance. If you do any of these things, you're going to end up with qi deficiency over time. On the air side of qi production, how much good qi is there in the air? It has to do with pollution, moisture content, environment, altitude, a bunch of different factors. This is part of the reason why when you go for a walk in the woods and you smell the air and it smells good, you feel better. There's good qi within that air. How we exactly figure out how much qi is in the air, completely subjective, but there's some obvious good examples and obvious bad examples. We're not necessarily talking about how much oxygen is present. We're not necessarily talking about gas exchange, but there's a lot of overlap here. We can easily point to things like being on the West Coast during fire season, the air is not good anymore. Being, in a forest in Boulder, Colorado, the air might be good, but the thinness might be an issue for some people. But this is something worth considering. Sometimes your patients will go on a vacation, come back, and all of a sudden they're qi deficient. And when you're talking to them, they're like, well, yeah, we were in, I remember I was in Taipei quite a while back during a ancestor respect ceremony. I don't remember the name for it. Everyone's burning ghost money outside of their places of business. The entire city's full of black smoke, black snot coming out of my nose for days, and developed a cough that lasted a few weeks. Your patient goes and has that experience. They come back, they're qi deficient. What's going on? You look at the air they've been interacting with. If you're produced qi well, you have strong defensive qi and strong nutritive qi. And if that happens, then other things work well. And if you have strong defensive qi, then you're not likely to get sick from external pathogens. If you're not producing qi well, then everything else falls apart. This is similar to someone who's just fasting or someone who breathes only with their accessory muscles. And over time, this begins draining kidney essence and ends up aging people prematurely. And within Western medicine, if you're looking at anatomy and physiology in a Western perspective, most of the feedback loops in the body are negative feedback loops. It's like, oh, what's a good example? If a person isn't breathing well and the acidity of their blood begins to go up, then we're going to be moving minerals out of the bones to compensate for that, or increasing urination, or we're going to find ways to balance things out. The body tends to return to homeostasis within a Western perspective because of these negative feedback loops. Within Chinese medicine, we have a lot of positive feedback loops, things where once it starts going wrong, it will naturally get worse, not better. And this is one of the examples. Once a person becomes qi deficient, unless they change their behavior, they're likely to become more and more qi deficient, which on a subjective level makes, at least to me, makes quite a lot of sense. And we see it all the time in the clinic. So hopefully that good little reminder about how qi production works. Let's go into what the qi does. So wei qi versus xie qi. Xie qi basically means evil qi. And for the next little bit, we're going to be talking about what wind cold and wind heat invasions look like. So external invasions, so 20 of us are in a room and there's a wind cold that comes through the room. Half of us get sick, half of us don't. Why? That's the question we're trying to answer here. And of the 10 that get sick, they get sick differently. Some of them get a head cold, some of them get sinus problems, some of them develop a cough with phlegm. Why are we all getting these different manifestations? What does that tell us about the people? And then how does that inform how we treat them? I'm going to need you guys to ask questions as we go through this because this is kind of complicated. Okay, but at the end of the day, it's the interaction between the wei qi, the defensive qi, and the xie qi, the pathological qi, the evil qi. If a patient has strong wei qi, that means they have a strong response. This is similar within in a Western medicine context, the fact that when you, let's say you get a cold, like a common cold, let's say you get the flu, when you get a fever, it's not the flu that's causing the fever, it's your response to the flu. Your body is what creates the fever. It's one of the issues that people who have suppressed immune systems, people who have AIDS, for example, aren't able to mount a defensive response. Them having a fever would be a good thing. The fever is our body fighting off the disease.
I have a quick question.
Sure, Carlin, go for
it. Is there a correspondence to the Western idea where you can have inflammation caused by your body to fight a pathogen, but the inflammation can become almost pathological itself?
100%.
So there's a correspondence.
Yeah, we're going to get to that in a minute.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So we very short version as a preview. We've got a series of types of being sick where all of the symptoms are your body fighting the pathogen. And then we've got a level past that where your body has basically given up on fighting the pathogen and your problems are from the pathogen itself. So we have to talk about both of those things. So generally speaking, the symptoms we see when people get sick are from us fighting the pathogen, not from the pathogen directly. The stronger the evil qi, the pathogenic qi is, the more danger we're in. So I want to decouple the level of response you see, how sick the person appears, from how much danger they're in, which is the strength of the pathogen. We're going to go through some basic examples here. We're going to kind of triangulate this a little bit. So if your wei qi is, these numbers are made up. We're just using a made up 1 to 5 system. If your wei qi is very strong and a weak pathogen comes in, you might feel sick for a few seconds. That kind of like, sudden like weird feeling in your neck, hairs rise on the back of your neck. You might cough for a second or two. You might sneeze. You might suddenly get a mild sweat that then goes away and you don't think anything of it and you don't get sick. If we're talking about the body as a walled city, this is like you have all of your guards on the wall of the city and a handful of infantry come to the wall, quick exchange, infantry's gone. Nothing really much to report, it's over. You or your patients won't know you've fought something off, and this happens all the time. This is similar to the Western medicine view. We're exposed to viruses and bacteria all the time. In general, they don't do anything. In general, we fight them off and that's the end of the story. That's what we're talking about here. If the Wei and the Xie are equal in power, that's when you would say as a patient, I feel like I'm fighting something right now. You can have somewhat extreme symptoms, could just look like the cold, or maybe a very large looking cold. It stays on the exterior, you tend not to get any digestive issues. It's just at the skin level. Could be gone in 20 minutes, could linger for a day or two, but the longer it lingers, the more likely it is to penetrate deeper into the system. So if the two are equal, it's an equal battle. The battle goes until one side begins winning or losing. If you've got less Wei Qi, if you've got less defensive Qi than the pathogenic, the evil Qi that's trying to come in, then you get sick. And the pathogen is going to progress. And if it's a wind-cold pathogen, it will progress in one manner. If it's a wind-heat, it will progress in another manner. If it has other things attached, it will behave differently once it gets in. But at this point, the pathogen has entered through the outer walls, and it's in your system, and you're going to have to deal with it on a deeper level. The amount of Wei Qi you have determines how extreme these symptoms will be. In this case, we'd expect this person to appear quite sick. So let's take this exact same thing where the Wei Qi is weaker than the Xie Qi and look at, and what does it look like if a person has a lot of defensive Qi and the pathogen is extremely strong? So these two are similar to what we looked at in the last slide, but because the person's defensive Qi is stronger, the symptoms are going to be stronger. You see this very commonly in people who are very athletic and who say, I never get sick, but when I do get sick, I get really sick for a few days. I sweat a ton, I spike a high fever, like I get a really intense flu, but it only happens every couple of years and it only lasts for a few days, but I don't get the sniffles. That's what we're looking at here. And then let's take this and let's keep the Xie Qi very strong, but lower the Wei Qi. So very strong pathogen, very weak patient. The patient will get ill, but they might not really get a lot of symptoms with this because they don't have an army to fight this battle. So if we're talking about the body as a walled city again, this is like the walls halfway fallen down and there's no one in it and the enemy just marches right in. If we see this person a month before this happens, we would be treating them to try to make their Wei Qi stronger. That would be our preventative medicine with this patient. We'd be saying, you don't have enough of a defense. We need to build this up. We have herbs for this. We have acupuncture points for this. And what tends to happen is the pathogen penetrates directly to the inside and begins causing other sorts of damage and stagnation. So often this patient who might say, I never really get sick, is having like, I never catch a cold, but I have all of these internal medical conditions that keep arising. And we see that because for them to catch a cold, to have a cold or a flu symptom, they would have to be able to fight it. And instead these things just come in and the traditional way of saying it is plunder the interior. Is this making some sense? Are you guys with me for this?
This last,
Alexa mentions that this is counterintuitive.
yeah, this last one is a little confusing. So what might that look like for a person? Would they have,
So
like, low energy?
So let's say today, let's say I have very low Wei Qi today, and I suddenly have a strong pathogen invade my system. It's not going to look like much at all. This is also true for someone who has severe enough AIDS or other types of immune disorders where a simple bacterial infection that you or I could fight off like that ends up being potentially lethal for them, but their fever doesn't go up. Like it's one of the hallmarks of people with very low immune systems that like you get worried about a 99.2 fever because that might be as big of a fever as they're able to get in that situation. So we see this sort of a setup as, in the extreme case, this is someone with a damaged immune system due to a viral infection. In a day-to-day case, this is someone who, going back up here, is not producing Wei Qi. This could be through diet. This could be through breathing. There's lots of reasons people don't produce Wei Qi. If we were to see them again a month before this happened, when they have weak Wei Qi, but there's no illness present, there's no external invasion, we would probably see them also having weak nutritive Qi. This person is going to tend to spontaneously sweat. They're likely to breathe shallowly and be mildly out of breath all the time. Low energy, doesn't want to stand up, sloped over posture. There's all sorts of things we're going to see that say to us, this person has a Wei Qi deficiency. Weak pulse, a tongue that's almost twitchy and kind of puffy and lots like fluids, a very wet tongue, which is a technical term, actually. All of those things combined make us go, we need to boost this person's Qi, because if they do get sick, that pathogen is going to penetrate deeply and cause more damage. That answer your question?
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
Good. Yeah, so Alexa mentioned that this sounds counterintuitive. Hopefully these first four are pretty intuitive. And then yes, this last one's a little counterintuitive. The piece that you just have to keep in mind is that if our body is fighting a pathogen, then the symptoms are from the fight. And if we don't have the strength to fight the pathogen, we tend not to get a lot of symptoms. We tend to get, in this case, often the symptoms begin to look more like exhaustion and depression and pain in the body and inability to get out of bed. Often it can begin to look more like chronic fatigue or fibromyalgia even. Yeah, that's what it tends to look more like. So the Wei Qi, I want you to think of it as the border guard. It's what rests at the outside of your body and fights off any invaders. And the Xie Qi is going to be the invading army. How strong our border guard is, that's how strong we can fight. How strong the invading army is, that's how dangerous the pathogen is. We talk about these invasions as going through stages or through levels, depending on which of these systems we're talking about. If we're talking about a wind cold, we're talking about this progression through stages into the body. If we're talking about the wind bing and wind heat, we're talking about these levels that it progresses through the body. Two different diagnostic systems, two different ways of talking about progression. You're going to see phrases like 6 stages and 4 levels. You should probably know those phrases, and that they go with the wind bing and the Shanghan Lun. So that if I were to ask you maybe on a multiple choice, the Shanghan Lun has, and it says 6 stages or 4 levels, I would hope you would know that. And this becomes, and what we're going to go over here is just a foundational way to think about how these diseases progress. We generally don't go deeper into this unless you're in the herbal program, because mostly we're going to work with these things with herbs in terms of the actual texts, but the theory is there for acupuncture as well. Let's see if we can just get through all of this before we take a break here. Should be about another 5 or 10 minutes. So these are the 6 stages. And it progresses from Taeyong to Yangming to Shaoyang to Taiyin to Shaoyin to Zhuiyin. This is progressing from exterior, most exterior to most interior. And you should recognize these names as the names of organ pairs on the body, right? This is something we're familiar with. Can someone, just as a quick test here, who knows what Taeyong organs are? Someone want to share that?
Small intestine and UB.
Great. People are familiar with that concept. Good. Thank you, Kendrick. These exterior ones, all of the yang organs, right? These look like a sick patient. These look like common cold and flu. And this is where we want to keep things. Now, that doesn't mean these can't be dangerous. You know, people die of high fevers during the flu. People die of complications. All of those things are still out here in the exterior. So it doesn't mean that these things can't be a problem. It's just not what we're really worried about in Chinese medicine, because in all of these, it's still Wei Qi fighting a pathogen. If the pathogen is able to get past the Wei Qi and into the interior, then it begins to damage these systems. So with Taiyin, we're talking about the spleen and the lung. If the pathogen gets to this level, then we begin to lose the ability to make postnatal Qi. And as we lose the ability to make postnatal qi, we develop a host of problems across our entire life. Once that's happened, we begin to lose our essence. It begins to affect the heart and the kidneys. These often look like a patient with a serious problem, but often within a Western testing rubric, there's nothing that can be found down here. Up here in the exterior, this all looks like disease. This is all familiar. Down here, this looks like a ton of different things where we say the word syndrome at the end, be it chronic fatigue syndrome or fibromyalgia, low-hanging fruit for those, or irritable bowel syndrome, or Crohn's disease, or ulcerative colitis, or leaky gut, and all of the other things that may or may not exist within a Western medical framework, but are certainly reflective of somebody who's suffering and not able to go about their activities of daily life. A lot of that we see down here in the interior. Just slightly further on this is about as deep as we're going to go, unless we have some extra time at the end of the semester. For the Taeyong, this looks like a common cold. Headache, chills. When you take their pulse, the pulse is floating and they're not sweating. We'll give them herbs and acupuncture that causes them to sweat, and the disease begins to go away. This is the type of disease we're talking about in the cultural understanding of the idea that sometimes when someone sweats, that means the fever breaks. That means the pathogen has begun to resolve. You'll hear this in terms of, like, my grandmother used to say, you get sick and then, you wrap them up, and when they start sweating, that means the disease is beginning to resolve. That's a Taeyong condition in Chinese medicine.
Can you?
From there we go to,
Sorry.
Go ahead.
You define what floating versus wiry feels like if you were taking a pulse?
Yes, but it's 11:02. Floating means that you feel it with the smallest amount of pressure possible. If you put your fingers on the person's radial pulse with about the same amount of pressure as a single piece of paper, I believe traditionally it was 3 mung beans worth of pressure, and you can feel their pulse strongly, that's a floating pulse. So we have different qualities we look at with pulses. One of them is depth of pulse. Floating is telling you something about the depth. Wiry is telling you something about the apparent level of tonicity of the walls of the artery. So wiry, it's a little more complicated, but wiry isn't telling you anything about how deep the pulse is. It's telling you about how tight the pulse feels. So wiry should feel like you're pressing on something hard like a wire. You should feel all of the edges of the vessel under your finger. That's compared with something like slippery, where there are no edges to the vessel, or something like thready, where yes, you feel the edges of the vessel, but it feels weak. So we have rate, we have depth, and we have tonicity of the vessel, and we have size of the vessel. We kind of work with all these different things, and a lot of phrases like wiry or slippery are combining a couple of them. But yeah. So deep would mean that you have to press down very hard, often almost to the bone, before you can even feel the pulse. And floating means like you barely touch their skin and the pulse is pounding on your finger immediately. That answer your question? You will have weeks of learning pulses next semester. And then once you do it 1,000 times, it'll start to make sense. I would strongly recommend people don't give up on learning how to read pulses, because it's very useful, but it's also kind of hard. So a lot of people give up. So just keep trying and you'll get there. Yang Ming, so Taeyong looks like the common cold. Yang Ming looks kind of like a stomach flu. We know it's a Yang Ming condition when the person has a big sweat, a big thirst, big fever, and a big pulse. So you take their pulse and it's something called a flooding pulse, which means that it's very large. Just leave it there for now. The person's constantly drinking water, they're pouring sweat out of everywhere, and they have a high fever. Now this one's dangerous in that the fever can get very high here. We can begin getting concerned about the level of fever that they have, but ultimately the Yang Ming channels are known as the most full of qi and blood. This is where we're able to make the biggest fight against the pathogen. If the pathogen still survives this, the patient is somewhat exhausted after this. They've sweat out a ton of things. They've used resources. The next stage, the Taeyong stage, starts to get a little bit stranger. This is where we begin doing things like putting a pathogen into latency, attempting to block the pathogen off. I think of this as like the invading army has made it into the city, but we've managed to lock them into one district or lock them or close them off in a building. And now we've got a stalemate. Your body and the pathogen are locked together, and you neither resolve the disease or get worse. And so what this tends to come with are alternating symptoms. So this is the person who, every few days, like clockwork, develops fever and chills and nausea and sweating, and then feels weak afterwards, and then they're fine for a week, and then it repeats. So it's a little bit of an odd way of looking at things, but it's a common type of disorder that people get. Oftentimes, we see this showing up in any sort of periodic disease. This is something we consider. So sometimes women will get cold and flu symptoms right before they get their period every time. Sometimes that's a Taeyong disorder, something stuck in latency. If we can clear out that Taeyong disorder, then they will stop having that occur when they get their cycle, but it has nothing to do with their hormone balance. It's a different idea. Got a question here in the chat. When we talk about 6 stages, 4 levels, is it always external disease? Yes. It's so, quick distinction. It's external disease in that the disease comes from the exterior, but it can penetrate into the inside of the person. So we can have an external disease that gets inside, but it's not an internal disease, because we're talking, when we say internal disease, we're talking about diseases that start on the inside. Does that make sense? Yes, the Xie is the pathogen's qi, not our qi. So for example, the coronavirus seems to have only moderately strong pathogenic qi. It as a disease, it's not super dangerous to the individual. It doesn't cause massive symptoms in most of the people. It's really not that dangerous of a disease, except that it's so infectious that it affects so many people that the fact that in general people are fine doesn't really matter because the numbers are too high. So we'd say that the coronavirus is not that pathological. The Xie is not that strong, it's just very communicable. Whereas something like Ebola would be an incredibly strong Xie pathogen, but it's not that communicable because people die too quickly to transmit it. Yeah. So this is all the exterior. This is your body fighting the pathogen on the outside. We see all of these as where you want the pathogen to be, because at this point, you're still able to produce qi and blood in yin and yang to continue to fight it and go about your life. If the pathogen continues, then it enters the interior and it begins affecting the Taeyong, the spleen and the lungs. And so you begin getting qi and blood deficiency and poor postnatal qi production that is not resolved by eating better food or by breathing better, because you've got something stuck here. And with this, you get quality of life decline that in quite a few people lasts for the rest of their life. From there, we go to Taeyong disorders, which is where you begin to get damage to the heart and the kidneys. And at this point, things like loss of purpose in life, loss of desire to get out of bed in the morning, and serious mental emotional disorders can begin to arise. And the Jueyin we're going to kind of not talk about for now, but it's considered like an end stage nearing death sort of condition. I've already taken you guys to, we just have 2 slides here. We're just going to talk about the 4 levels for 1 minute, and then I'm going to have you take a break. Sorry about that. So this is all wind cold penetration. That's the 6 stages. This is the introduction to this transmission model. Wind cold passes through all of this, causes damage on the way. Here we fight it. Here it damages the qi and then the yang, and then becomes potentially deadly. Pathogens tend to hang out in Taeyong and Yangming for days to a week. Taeyong, it can hang out for days to years. And once you get down to Taeyong and Taeyong, unless the patient does something to remove this pathogen, it will basically stay there forever. Within the 4 levels, we're talking about a wind heat pathogen invading the person's system, going again from the exterior to the interior. And starting with the Wei Qi, we're going to be told where the heat pathogen is. Starts off in the Wei, at the exterior. Also kind of looks like the common cold, except in this case, the person's sweating profusely and their pulse is going to be rapid in addition to floating. I'm not expecting you to remember the details of this, by the way. It goes into the Qi level there, from there, which looks a lot like Yang Ming, lots of sweating, lots of thirst, big pulse, big sweat. And then from there, it passes into the Ying and the Shui. The Ying side looks like neurological disorders. So this is where we start to get things like behavioral changes from a high fever. Like, I don't know if anyone here has had a high enough fever to begin hallucinating. It's not fun. That's over here on the Ying side. This is also where things like having a stroke from a high fever can show up, or having seizures. And the blood side of things, which is where you begin to get bleeding disorders. Now on the extreme side, Ebola fits into this perfectly, where you quickly get this disease that causes you to bleed out of most of your orifices. On the smaller side, this can be someone who gets chronic nosebleeds from a pathogen locked in the Shui level. This can be women who have excessively heavy periods after getting sick that don't seem to go away. There's lots of ways that we have weird chronic bleeding. People who have occult bleeding, blood in their stools, that they've been to doctors, nothing can be found. They just keep getting blood in their stools. This might be a heat pathogen trapped at that level. Same for some people who develop neurological tics and twitches. Some types of Parkinson's look like heat in the Yin level. Within Western medicine, we just have Parkinson's disease. Within Chinese medicine, we have like 4 or 5 types of Parkinson's disease. So one of them is this. And that gets described here. So much like Taeyong, the Wei Qi looks like scratchy throat, rapid pulse, sweating, and fever. The Qi level looks exactly like Yang Ming, except that it moves faster as a heat pathogen. And the Yang is seizure, stroke, neurological. And the Shui is bleeding, rashes, and looks more like a hemorrhagic fever. And that's your introduction to external diseases in terms of how they actually progress, what the Wei and Xie Qi fighting together looks like. Let's take a 10-minute break, and I will be around for questions if you have them. And then we'll come back, a little bit more time for questions, and we'll dive into a little more material. So please come back at 11:22. And I'm around for questions.
Yeah, I have a question.
Please.
So I wanted to ask you about sauna and what the perception of sauna in Chinese medicine as a way to cause, I call it an artificial fever.
Sure, yeah.
Or activate immune response, or perhaps in Chinese medicine, it would be like activating Wei Qi. So could you tell me a little bit about it's used in Chinese medicine, if it's advised by Chinese medicine providers to the patients, and what's just the perspective in general on it?
So we see sauna, so dry versus wet heat is going to be a little bit different. So whether you're talking about a steam room or a sauna, a little bit different. We see it as neither good nor bad, sometimes good, sometimes bad. So depending on what's going on with the patient, the question is, do we want to add heat to their system or not? Heat is going to cause things to move around. It's going to cause things to speed up. So if a person has a wind-cold invasion, or even just a cold invasion, if they're spending time outside in cold weather, this heat will help to break up that cold and improve circulation in their system, and that's a good thing. If a person lives in Louisiana and they've spent the entire day in 95-degree damp heat, we don't necessarily want to then put them in a sauna afterwards. If we have a patient who has a lot of energy and a lot of fluids and a lot of yin, then putting them in a sauna and having them lose, 5 pounds of sweat, that's not that unreasonable. We're not that worried about that. On the other hand, if we have someone who's very anemic and really weak and really tired, putting them in that situation might drain them more. Mm-hmm. Right? So like if the person, now sometimes that might be worth it. That might be an acceptable trade, but you want to think it through. So in some conditions, very good. In other conditions, potentially dangerous. That's the answer. That's the short answer. And then figuring out when it's good and when it's bad is part of the skill set that you're going to be continuing to learn here. I definitely know people who have caused damage to themselves from excessive hot or cold therapy. Because at this point, things like ice baths are popular with some people, and like drinking ice water to boost your metabolism, or like trying to develop heat shock proteins from, oh, you go in the sauna, then you jump in the cold water, then you go in the sauna, then you jump in the cold water, and you go in the sauna. It's like, well, that's appropriate for some people, but for other people, that's just going to get them sick. That's just going to use reserves they don't have. So it depends a bit, but in some situations, it's very good. So for me, it's good, but for other people, it wouldn't be.
Right, but would it be fair to say that those people who you say might affect negatively, they just need gradually expose themselves to that, to build the tolerance to that, to actually get the benefit of it? Because I usually do it as a generally like a benefit for virtually everyone, because I've I've been raised doing that since I was probably very little, 5 years old. My grandma would just dump ice cold water on me every time after I take a bath or hot shower, just for better blood circulation, and this like she was trying to strengthen the immune system. So ever since then, I used it in my life, and it never let me down. So I always advise to everyone to do that. But what you're saying, I would like your a little bit more on that. Why would you say it's not as beneficial for some people as for others?
People have different reactions to heat. Some people would benefit more from cold therapy. Some people benefit more from hot. If someone's very healthy, sauna's fine in general. It will help with circulation. It'll help boost their immune system. That heat will get rid of stagnation that's in their system. That's a good thing. But a lot of people aren't healthy. And for some of the people that aren't healthy, that's going to be the wrong sort of therapy. In the same way that, like, is hot yoga good for everybody? It's like, well, look, some people shouldn't sweat that much. That's just how it is in the Chinese medicine way of thinking. And at the same time, like when I lived in Central America, we do temescals, traditional saunas there, but like you don't do that during the summer when it's hot. You don't do that when it's 95 degrees outside already, right? So like there are certainly obvious situations.
You wouldn't want to do it naturally. It's just that your body, most of the time, we don't do that in the summertime, correct? Yes.
Right. It's like there's clearly times where it's more and less appropriate, and patients where it's more and less appropriate. If someone's healthy, if someone's generally healthy, and if they have physical pain, like knee pain or low back pain, then I would generally say sauna is probably going to be good for you. Like get that blood flowing, get that circulation going, get that good sweat that just kind of clears you out a little bit. But it's similar to, like, I don't know, it has a detoxifying function, but you need to have enough that you can detoxify. If someone like can barely get out of bed because they're so sick, then getting in the sauna and sweating a bunch might remove the last little bit of hydration they have. And then they can't poop the next day. And now they're constipated, and now we have to deal with that. So generally, good. Some cases, quite damaging.
I understand where you're coming from. I understand. It's all about balance at the end.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and that's one of the central ideas of Chinese medicine. There are no things that are good for everybody.
Right. All right.
There aren't.
Thank you, Peter. Okay.
You're very welcome.
Left, so I'll get off here now to give you a break. Okay. Thank you, Peter.
Thanks. All right. I've got a question here in the chat that was sent privately, so I'm not going to say who it's from. Peter, at the Taeyong level, there is no sweating presented, but a good way to get rid of the pathogen is to induce sweating. Is that correct? Basic answer is yes, but you don't, and sometimes the sauna can be a way to do that. We tend to use herbs that promote sweating, or acupuncture that promotes sweating, or even things that promote sweating locally. Like when you use cupping on somebody, they'll tend to sweat in that area, and often we'll use cupping. with acupuncture and some herbs, and can kick off the common cold, like a Taeyong presentation, in 20 minutes, half an hour. Excuse me. There are versions of the Taeyong condition where that whole story changes, but this is the most common one. Sometimes people show up with a Taeyong condition where they are sweating because they have internal deficiency as well, but don't worry about the other levels of complexity. That's the best answer. Exercise is not always the best idea at the Taeyong level, because part of this is you want to sweat and you want to push outwards, and sometimes a lot of movement can just increase circulation and draw things inwards. So we use the most commonly used herb for this is going to be ma huang, ephedra herba, which contains a little bit of ephedrine in it, a natural bioform of ephedrine, which will cause some of that sweating to occur. We mix that with ginger and apricot kernels, which help prevent coughing, and a little bit of licorice, and we're good to go. That would be ma huang tong. Question from Kirby. Hey, listening in and can attest to hot yoga. Bikram specifically, not always being appropriate. I learned the hard way that too much heat is not a benefit for me specifically. Yeah, so Kirby, I'd be happy to hear a little bit more about your experience. One of the things I've seen from people who do too much hot yoga, all of that sweating, our fluids occupy different parts of our bodies. And people can be hydrated in one area, they can have proper fluids in one area while not having proper fluids in another. And most of the sweating that comes from things like Bikram yoga specifically, a little bit different with the sauna because you're not necessarily twisting out your body while you do it. A lot of the sweat that comes in Bikram yoga comes out of the muscle layer. And so afterwards, people can end up with things like cramping that starts in their neck, occipital headaches, cramping in the calves, because they are lacking fluids in their muscles. And that's not necessarily something that you can just replace by drinking water. It can be a little bit challenging to undo that. And if that continues long-term enough, patients can end up dry, and all of a sudden they're starting to get things like skin rashes or itchy skin or dandruff showing up because they're damaging this fluid over and over, and it's causing problems. And of course, we have a survivorship bias in terms of people who like Bikram yoga. The people it doesn't work for don't talk about it that much, and they're not going to the classes all the time. They're not wearing the sweatshirt, and they're not going to Bikram yoga events. People it works for tend to stick with it.
Hi, yeah, so Peter, do you need a break? Or do you want to talk about this? Or do you need a break?
Yeah, go for it. No, I'm good.
Cool.
I do not need a break. Go ahead. Kirby, if you're talking, I can't hear you.
Okay, I'm just getting to a place to actually sit.
Sure.
Peter, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Kirby.
Sorry about that.
No, it's all good.
The conversation you were having just a second ago with the other student, I think it's really interesting, especially in the West, and especially with exercise. People don't take their compositions or constitutions into account at all. And I was one of those people. And I you know, I think that people are just focused on, like, generally, not everybody, of course, but especially in the yoga world, my God, are very focused on just body and what I call sexy stretching. And Bikram is so much like, oh, sweat and lose weight. And I had a lot of benefits from it, but I started to get very sick. And then I learned, one of the teachers just happened to say, you know, heat's not like necessary for everybody because of your constitution. And I was, my ears kind of perked up. And so I then learned about the doshas and learned, oh, I have a lot of pitta, and I get very sick from too much heat. And so something like Bikram, it's not like I should definitely, I don't even really know if like anybody should really do it in the summer, in my opinion, but I really like stepped away from it. And every once in a while I'll take a hot class or whatever, but I found I would just get really sick. And I think, you know, a detox is really good. Sweating can be great, but for me, at least, all within moderation. I learned the hard way because I'm already hot and typically sweat easy as it is. So it was not like a benefit all the time.
Yep. Good. I appreciate you contributing your experience around that. I mean, I've when I lived in Guatemala, I spent my weekends in a place called Lake Atitlan, and there's about 7 yoga teacher training schools in Lake Atitlan. And so I saw people coming through all the time for these 1-month intensive yoga teacher training programs. And I ran a clinic there. And so I treated a lot of these people. And there were plenty of yoga people who I don't have, first off, I have nothing against yoga. What I have a problem with is people who haven't fully thought through the medical advice they give people. And there were plenty of people there who were not healthy, who perceived themselves to be very healthy. The number of young, like early 20s women who were there learning to be yoga teachers, who were no longer getting a period and had been told by their teacher that that's a good sign, that they're very clean and spiritual now. That was a huge problem. So I made it a habit of getting, like, I became known as the person who told everyone to eat steak, because so many of these like younger, anemic, they're like, I'm freezing cold all the time and I don't get my period and I'm exhausted and my hair is really dry, but I hear that's a good thing. What do you think? Like,
wow.
No, but you know, people like to be involved in something, and yoga is supposed to be healthy. And it's, yes, it is, but you have to actually adapt it for yourself.
I could go on and on about yoga and what it's supposed to be. We don't have to go into it, but I could go on and on. It's like, yeah, definitely been taken in many different directions, and people like have no idea what the fuck they're doing, in my opinion. So that's unfortunate. Well, and I'm not surprised.
I'm just going to put out there are plenty of people who are practicing Chinese medicine who aren't doing a great job of it either. You know, this is a fairly universal thing. So, you know, for the people here, I'm sure there's some people in this class who are yoga teachers. I'm certainly not denigrating yoga as a whole.
I'm a yoga teacher. I'm like all in it.
There you go.
But also see that there are, like you just said, as someone who's in acupuncture practice, you see that there are people like not doing so great, or maybe not as connected as they could be, or, you know, whatever we want to call it. So it's okay to critique within your profession. I think it's necessary. Yeah. Cool. I appreciate the discourse.
All right. Thanks, Kirby.
No problem.
Yeah. Appreciate you contributing.
Yeah.
Thank you. Anyone have any other questions before we dive into the next piece?
Just that, is mental health in this in any way, like, or is it just you look at those other symptoms that show up?
So when we're talking about the Shanghan Lun, the 6 stages, as long as it's on the exterior, we don't really see changes to mental functioning. Like, mental health doesn't get affected by, not very much at least, by the Taeyong, Yangming, or Shaoyang. Once the pathogen penetrates to the interior, then we start to see changes to the person's mental functioning, potentially. So, for example, like it's not that the pathogen is causing the changes, it's that the pathogen is changing your life experience. And if your life experience changes, then the way you think will change. So, for example, someone who's always been fit and strong and had lots of energy, if they have a pathogen that gets into the Tai-yin level, it can begin to sap away their vitality. If someone's perspective on how the world works and their perspective on what happiness is for them, if it's based around their vitality and their vitality goes away, then their mental health is going to be affected. It just will be. That's inherent. So once that begins happening, then we've got a whole other thing to work with. And questions like, so do you accept the changes? Am I just getting older? What do I do with this? And some of this becomes like, especially in younger people who are trying to start a life, if all of a sudden they lose a lot of their vitality and they're like, now I'm having trouble making it to work on time, and I'm no longer passionate about what I do, that can really cause a lot of long-term damage to mental health. And especially and then that compounds, because when you're depressed, you don't want to eat as well. and you don't want to exercise, and you don't want to take care of yourself as much. So we get a positive feedback loop there as well, where like once the person begins getting deficient, begins having their vitality drained on that level, then they tend to stop engaging in behaviors that would be corrective and instead engage in behaviors that make it worse. That answer your question? Cool, thank you. Any other questions before we start up the next part? Okay, let's dive into, I don't know if we should start this with an hour left. 45 minutes left. This is, yeah, this is for next week. We're not gonna do this right now. I'm gonna skip around a little bit. We're gonna save this. This is important, but we really need to have like 2 hours for this. That goes away. I would love it if you guys look over that set of slides before next week. Because when we start talking about how imbalances within the system work, it works. It's one of them. It's the most difficult subject we're going to talk about this semester. So we're not going to do that with 45 minutes left. We're going to just dive right into internal pathogenic factors here. And we can get through a few of these. So with the exception of that one lecture that I just temporarily skipped for next week, this is what the rest of the semester is going to look like. We are going to go through a ton of different things and begin to give you a feeling and an understanding of what they look like. So we're going to start off with what these pathogenic factors look like. Like, what is the difference between cold and heat within a person's body? What does wind look like? How do we know? So we talk about chi stagnation and blood stagnation, but it's all airy-fairy and over here. So let's talk about what it looks like concrete inside your patients. And then after this, we're going to go through all of the organs. That's going to take 4 weeks to go through all of them. And we're going to do the same thing. What does it look like when there's a spleen problem? What does it look like when there's a small intestine problem? And by the end of that, you will have a basic feeling and understanding of what all of the pathogenic factors are, with this being the list of pathogenic factors. You're going to have a feeling for all of the pathogenic factors, and you're going to have a feeling for all of the organs, which means that I can begin to ask you questions about that are like, hey, you know what internal wind looks like. Here are a couple wind symptoms, and you know what liver pathology looks like. And here's a couple liver things, and you should be able to figure out that it's wind in the liver. That might sound a little daunting right now, but by the end of the semester, based on previous final exams, you will be able to actually answer case studies with pathogen and location. Okay, so we're gonna start diving into this. By the end of next week, we will finish this entire slide and the one I just skipped. So let's just dive into this for now. So we talked about internal causes of disease, like emotions and lifestyle. And now we're gonna talk about what do they create? So, okay, anger causes the chi to rise, but what does that then do? And this is the basic picture that we're looking at. We have a cause, like anger, and then we have a pathogenic factor, like heat, and then we have something like tinnitus, a symptom. So we've talked about the causes of disease, the external causes, the internal causes, and the miscellaneous causes. And now we're going to say, so these are causes of disease. What is the disease they make? And then from disease they make, we get to symptom. And the disease we make to symptom part is going to be like another year of your study. These are really all the pathologies. Of course, they can mix and match, and they can become compound or multi-layered, but this is everything, really, for types of pathologies that you get internally. And that's what this entire slide deck is for, to go through all of these. In addition, so these are all excess pathologies. And in addition to that, we can look, there are deficiencies that can happen. Do I have to talk about that here? Yeah, I do.
Where is the slide deck?
Oh, let me, that's right, I need to give it to you. Since I just changed the schedule, I should probably upload this. Thank you for speaking up. sorry about changing this. Otherwise, we're just losing 45 minutes here or leaving you all very confused in a very rude way by trying to do that other part. So it's in the chat now. And now it's also up on week 4 in the Slack. So you can get it either one of those locations. All right. So these are all excess pathologies. These are all things you accumulate that you can get rid of. In addition to this, you can have deficiencies, but we're going to talk about those later, like qi deficiency or blood deficiency or yin or yang deficiency, but that comes later. Today, we're doing the general ones. So like, what does heat look like in general? And then when we get to the organs, we'll do the individual organs. Right, I already said that. So let's dive right into this. Qi stagnation. So qi stagnation is the most common thing that we have. Everyone has qi stagnation at all times. It can be caused by basically anything. Emotions can cause it, diet can cause it, exercise or lack of exercise can cause it, and it can be caused by disharmonies between the organs. It can be caused by transient thoughts. It can be caused by shock. It can be caused by anger. It can be caused by joy. Qi stagnation happens anytime the free flow of qi is interrupted within the body. It can be caused by physical injury. Qi stagnation is the most common thing we have. Every ache or pain that you ever have in your body has qi stagnation attached to it. Eliminating qi stagnation from people's systems or reducing it as much as possible is one of the things we do when we do preventative medicine. So sometimes people have a ton of qi stagnation throughout their system due to years of improper life. Some people have a very small amount that's kind of a normal transient amount of qi stagnation. If we get rid of it, they have better circulation, their body works better. All emotions can and tend to cause qi stagnation. Joy and rumination will directly create qi stagnation. That slowing down, that slackening of the qi causes some of the qi to stagnate. And the nodding of the qi with rumination will directly, that nodding is qi stagnation. But the other emotions will indirectly cause qi stagnation. So when anger causes the qi to rise, for example, after that rising, if the qi gets stuck in the head, you get a headache or tinnitus. If afterwards the person's exhausted and the qi falls down, then they get qi stagnation lower in their body. When shock scatters the qi that's remaining often becomes stagnant. When it becomes sad, and some of the qi dissolves, some of the qi that remains can become stagnant. When we're looking at sadness, the dissolving of the qi that comes with sadness tends to result in qi deficiency. If we think of the circulation of qi through the body like water through rivers or a stream, when the level of the water in the stream gets low enough, you start getting these pockets that are separate, almost like tide pools with the ocean. And so as the qi levels go down, we get areas that become stagnant within the body. So qi deficiency tends to come with qi stagnation, and therefore sadness, which causes qi deficiency, will cause qi stagnation as well. So oftentimes people who are sad for extended periods of time begin developing stiffness, begin developing aches and pains, begin to become more sensitive within their physical body as the qi stagnates. Oh, I said this exact thing here. Okay. This is true of blood stagnation as well. So people who are really blood deficient tend to develop blood stagnation very easily. This is one of the reasons why people who have blood deficiency or who have anemia tend to bruise very easily. Due to the lack of strong, robust blood flow in their body, due to a lack of sufficient blood, it doesn't take much for the blood to not continue on with that flow. When you have a rapidly moving river, a sudden obstacle is pushed out of the way or gone around. When you have a very low river, it's easy to dam it up and create stagnation. Same is true for qi and for blood. These are the symptoms of qi stagnation. How do you know if someone has qi stagnation? Why would you care if someone has qi stagnation? Well, these are the main symptoms. If a patient is bloating or distension anywhere in their body, it can be objective and obvious with the abdomen, but it can also be subjective, of that feeling of pressure in your head, or a feeling of pressure within a joint, that bloated, distended feeling. It can be edema within the ankles from the distension of the veins. All of that's qi stagnation. Pain. There's only two causes of pain within the body: qi and blood stagnation. All pain is qi and or blood stagnation. There are no other reasons that pain gets created. Lots of things cause qi and blood stagnation, as we're discussing here, but if we move the qi in the blood, the pain goes away. The qi and the blood stagnation might come back and the pain might come back. Excuse me. This is one of the reasons why applying things like capsaicin plasters will resolve pain temporarily within Chinese medicine. That addition of heat and irritation to the area causes the qi in the blood to move. The moving of the qi in the blood gets rid of the pain. You take the plaster off. If you haven't addressed the reason there was qi and blood stagnation in the first place, then it comes back and the person gets pain again. Wiry pulse is a big one for qi stagnation. Don't worry too much about that now. And then irritability and sighing. So a patient who's easily irritated, or a patient who's doing that sort of thing consistently in your office, they're telling you that they have qi stagnation. Qi stagnation affects the entire body, but we see it affects the most on the digestive system, the spleen and the stomach, which is the thing most people associate with, say, bloating or distension. Like after a big meal that's too heavy, often we get qi stagnation. That affects the spleen and stomach. That's what the bloating is in Chinese medicine. After that, the most discussed thing in relation to qi stagnation is the liver. It's also the organ we most connect with irritability. And then the last one's the lung. We get a lot of qi stagnation in the chest sometimes. And that's all I really expect you to know about qi stagnation for now. I do expect you to know all of the things that I just covered. Any quick questions about qi stagnation? It's one of the harder ones to understand because it's so general. As we get into like heat and fire versus cold, the distinctions are very obvious, but qi stagnation, because it kind of affects everywhere, and basically any discomfort in the body can be qi stagnation. It's a little bit harder to pin down. You guys have any questions about this one?
I do. So when you're doing
Please.
tongue diagnosis, you see the stagnation in the area of tongue that's related to the organ?
Yep. So the classic lines for liver qi stagnation look like this. It's hard to do this. You can see it a little bit on my tongue. There's kind of lines, there's like kind of thick, mildly pale lines. And then on the outside of that, there's a little bit of an indentation. That's liver qi stagnation lines. That's because I've been overworking and I'm a little stressed. Every single Western medical practitioner has severe liver qi stagnation lines. The process of going through school, the way that the hospitals are organized, it's basically impossible to get through that without severe liver qi stagnation. If on the other hand, you have it in, say, the heart or the lungs, you'll see the markings more likely to show up in those areas. But short answer is yes. I'm not really talking about the tongue here, and I'm not going to talk about the pulse much because you have a whole semester for that. The tongue is so informative. Once you get good at tongue diagnosis, not only can you tell what's going on with the person, but you can tell what was going on before what's currently going on, which is cool. Okay. Any other qi stagnation questions? Okay. Let's go into blood stagnation or blood stasis. There's a bunch of different terms that get used for blood not moving well. Don't worry about whether it's stagnation or stasis or whatever for now. There's some disambiguation that can happen, but don't worry too much. Just blood not moving well, blood stasis. Super common, but less common than qi stagnation. People get small amounts of it, that's normal, but like systemically large amounts of it, you get large amounts of qi stagnation all the time with patients. You don't get a large amount of blood stagnation that often. It can also be caused by basically anything, but its most common cause is qi stagnation. Qi stagnation that lasts for a long time will tend to turn into blood stagnation. So this is the person whose mildly achy shoulder over time begins to lock up, begins to become more painful, and begins to become more direct where the problem is. With qi stagnation pain, I see some people moving their shoulders. With qi stagnation pain, you tend to have it in an area. So a patient will come in and they'll say, my chief complaint here. They're talking about blood stagnation. Blood stagnation is local and it tends to be more painful. And qi stagnation is general and tends to be more distending or bloaty. So you're looking for very localized pain as a chief symptom here. And you're also looking for purple hues. So a patient who comes in with that ruddy complexion, who looks a little bluish or purplish, that's a sign that the person probably has blood stagnation. Regardless of their skin color, you can see this on their fingernails. You can see this on their lips. This is also, it's a lot easier to work with blood-related issues with women because through their cycle, we can work with their blood. The quality of a woman's cycle tells us a lot about what's going on in terms of her general internal conditions. It's actually harder to work with men for these things because we just don't have as many we don't have as much diagnostic information. Things like heavy clotting, especially if they're large, dark colored clots, can be a sign of blood stagnation. And oftentimes for women who have serious blood stagnation in the lower part of their body, as we're treating them, their menstruation will get heavier and clots will show up as the blood stagnation resolves. That's super common. You can actually use their menstrual cycle as a way of getting stagnant blood out of the body. Whereas
Peter,
with
can I
men, we
ask
have
you a
to do more
question?
bleeding techniques. Yeah.
Sorry, is blood stagnation, no, I'm sorry, actually the question is are vein diseases like deep vein thrombosis and blood disorders, are those forms of blood stasis and extreme, like those are extreme cases?
I mean, I'm not quite sure what you mean by blood disorders. Yes, but they're not necessarily the root. Often there's something, blood stagnation doesn't happen on its own. Something causes blood stagnation. So while something like a deep vein thrombosis there is blood stagnation occurring there, we're often more concerned about something like heat present that's cooking down the blood and causing the blood stagnation in the first place.
Wow.
And we'll get to heat further down on this list because all of these internal things interact with each other. Cool. Okay. Just a quick reminder, Western medical blood and Chinese medicine blood, overlapping Venn diagrams. There are similarities. There are things that are the same about the two of them, but there are things that are different. If a patient comes in and they seem really blood deficient to me, I don't really care what their hematocrit levels are. I don't really care if they have anemia within a Western medical sense. That being said, if they come in and they have anemia, I'm thinking, and before we even start, like if on their intake form that they submit online to me, they tell me that they've been diagnosed with anemia, I'm thinking to myself, there's a very good chance they have blood deficiency within the Chinese medicine system. So there's overlap, but they're not the same thing. I already said this. Yeah, go ahead.
You say that in a weird sort of way, maybe having issues with your physical blood in a Western medicine sense would overlap more onto a Chinese medicine sense than the Chinese medicine blood would like if you have some sort of blood issue as diagnosed in Western medicine, like you might look at the blood more closely in your Chinese
medicine. I missed all of that. I'm sorry, you completely froze on my screen. So if you wouldn't mind repeating that, I would appreciate it.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I guess my question is like, if they tell you that they have been diagnosed with something related to the blood, like anemia or something else like that, I can't like off the top of my head, but like, would you look at the blood more closely, like automatically in your diagnosis, or like could it just be something else entirely?
It could be something else entirely. I'm certainly going to pay attention to their blood, but that might not be where I care about what's going on. So like, for example, if a patient comes in and they've got severe tinnitus, I'm not really going to look at their ears. I don't really care what's going on with their ears. Someone could come in and have bleeding disorders. A woman could come in with long-term menstrual issues. I don't necessarily care about their uterus. I might, like through investigation, that might become something that like we're going to do Chung channel treatments, and we're going to do local needling in like the lower Ren channel to help resolve issues right there in the uterus. On palpation, like right below the umbilicus, I might feel things that feel like cysts and might encourage them to go get scans. But just because they have heavy bleeding or a lack of bleeding or heavy clots or a lot of cramps, I don't necessarily care about what's going on with their uterus. That make sense? Cool. Okay, let's start this back up. Good questions today, guys. I appreciate it. This stuff is challenging, and so through asking questions, this gets personalized, and that's doubly challenging when we're online and I can't see all of you. So the more you ask questions, the better. And if it gets to be too much, then we'll work with that, but it isn't. So if you're an acupuncturist, you don't really care about the difference between stagnation and stasis of the blood. If you're an herbalist, you do. And if you're an herbalist, you'll get taught this stuff while you're studying herbs. Oh, sorry, Melissa, SLV is sublingual vein. So when we do tongue diagnosis, we look at the top, and we look at the bottom, and underneath, mine are very minor, but we have these veins underneath. Some people have black branching veins that look so distended that they're about to pop. If they have that, we know they have a lot of blood stagnation. So tongue SLV, that's what we're referring to. Yeah, so distended SLV on this slide. That's what I'm talking about. With acupuncture, like let's say we want to move someone's blood stagnation, and we're just talking about needles. We're not talking about cups or moxa or any of the other tools we have. We're just talking about needles. How strongly we move the blood is often how strongly we stimulate the needles. When we're talking about herbs, if we want to move the blood strongly, we choose different herbs. We don't just dose the herbs up to get stronger and stronger movement. So we kind of grade how bad blood stagnation is in herbology, and in acupuncture, there's more flexibility. But so now, yeah, within herbology, we talk about regulating blood, invigorating blood, and breaking blood. Within acupuncture, we might use the same point, but we're talking about different needle technique for all of those things. So we care about these distinctions less in acupuncture because there's more in the moment ability to modify. And within herbology, you've got to choose in advance what you're doing. A lot of the times, acupuncture is a lot more like cooking on a stove, doing a stir fry, and herbology is a lot more like baking. You have to be very precise in advance, and then you don't get to adjust it once it starts. We already talked about this. Qi stagnation is diffuse and tends to be more mild. Blood stagnation is sharp and stabbing and tends to be more extreme. So a person who comes in with severe abdominal pain and a stabbing single location, excuse me, we're going to be treating them for blood stagnation. If someone comes in and they say, my entire abdomen hurts, especially if it's also bloated, we're going to be treating them more for Qi stagnation. Blood stagnation is caused by a pretty good sized list of things. Qi stagnation causes it, that's the most common. Cold causes blood stagnation. At some point, you're going to hear that pain from cold is the worst type of pain in Chinese medicine. And that's true, but it's only true because the cold causes blood stagnation. It causes blood stagnation, and the nature of cold is to contract. So it causes blood stagnation, and then it's like it adds pressure on top of the blood stagnation. So when you have patients who come in with things like irritable bowel syndrome with extreme pain, who've had exploratory surgery because the pain is so bad that they're happy to accept that trade, oftentimes we're talking about cold in the intestines. And oftentimes that cold in the intestines is coming from long-term dietary errors that involve far too much cold food. Heat can cause blood stagnation, though it has a little bit of a different mechanism. Heat has a, oh, I go through all these things. Okay. Sorry, I'm doing all this from memory off of this slide, but we have a slide for every one of these. Carlin, I didn't know you sing.
Oh, can you hear me? I'm sorry, I'm just humming to myself.
That's okay.
Sorry about that.
No. It was a pleasant diversion. Okay, so blood and qi are in a yin and yang relationship with each other. The two of them interact with each other like yin and yang do as a pair. If one of them gets stagnant, the other one tends to get stagnant. So one stops, the other tends to. So we try to figure out which one's the more important one in terms of the stagnation, and then we're going to treat that. The treatment will tend to focus on whichever one we see as the dominant player in that pairing, but they tend to go together. And when one is deficient, the other tends to become deficient as well. Blood stagnation due to cold. Cold causes things to contract and stagnate, much like putting water in a freezer, except the expanding part. It causes things to get hard, firm up. We have to break the cold open. In the case of blood, it causes the blood to stagnate, usually in a very localized way. So some patients come in and kind of have systemic blood stagnation. And often they're going to be the patients who come in who are on blood thinners with high blood pressure and have a darkened purplish skin color and nail beds with poor capillary refill. And you push down on their finger and it takes a little while for the color to come back. That tends to be a sign of generalized blood stagnation. But other patients come in and the only sign they have of blood stagnation is that one stabbing pain in that one place, and otherwise they're fine. The one place is more likely due to cold, and the general blood stagnation is more frequently due to heat. So heat, the nature of heat, the nature of cold is that it causes things to stagnate, congeal, or stagnate and condense. And yeah, stop moving. The nature of heat is that it speeds things up, dries them out, and causes them to derange a little bit, behave inappropriately. Blood stagnation can be caused by any of these things. If the heat in the blood is causing the blood to flow improperly, is causing it to derange, you get things like bloody noses from patients. This is often what we're concerned about when patients have high blood pressure and are on blood thinners and are worried about having a stroke or have had strokes. That heat in the blood causes the blood to flow out of the vessels. Often you see this in older patients who say to you things like, oh, I bruise very easily, but as you look over their body, they just have mild subdermal bruising all over the place. Often that's heat in the blood causing the blood to just leak out. Drying of the blood, so as the heat dries the blood down, it's like it's cooking it down, the blood can begin to stagnate. Often these people are also on blood thinners because they tend to clot easily because of the blood being cooked down. And the easiest way to get rid of heat in the blood is to bleed your patients. We're not talking about like early American medicine of opening a vein and taking out a pint. Like that's not what we mean by bleeding. We mean a handful of drops out of points. And by a handful, I mean like 6. What you'll often see happen is when you bleed an acupuncture point near the area, the blood will come out very dark, and then the color will change. And what's said in the older texts is once the color changes, you've gotten the problem out. This is one of the treatments that we use for spider veins, not varicose veins. Don't bleed varicose veins. But for spider veins, we can get rid of them by just bleeding them over and over again. I've had a number of older patients who've come in who have a lot of spider veins on their legs, and we spend half an hour with me using diabetic lancets and just prick, 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 drop or two of blood out of each one. The next week, their veins are gone and the pain in their legs is gone. Because despite that just being superficial obstruction of minor capillaries, that blood stagnation will cause pain. So easiest, fastest treatment for heat in the blood is bleeding. You're not going to bleed very much in school because it's just a whole thing for the school to have to deal with blood, but excellent techniques. I do it, I don't know, 1 out of every 10 patients. You can also get, yeah, go ahead.
Quick note on spider veins. I've spent at least 5 years managing medical practice for a varicose vein doctor. and we had this treatment, sclerotherapy, for spider veins specifically. And the treatment is basically, it's a micro injection with a substance that dissolves the spider vein. So I kind of look at it now as very similar to what you're saying. Yeah. So just wanted to.
No, thanks for adding that in. What I often see this, one of the things that acupuncture does is it tells the body to go heal a certain area locally. So if someone comes in with like a cut on their arm, let's say they just had surgery and they've got stitches on their arm, we'll often do a thing called surround the dragon, where we just fill the area around that with needles. I think of this as telling the body, is triggering a second healing response by saying like, we're sending you all the signals that you've had another major injury here. So the body's going to come in and repair the area. I think a lot of these bleeding techniques and even damaging the local veins has a similar function of the body recognizes the trauma. It recognizes all of these punctures of the skin in the area, in the case of what I'm doing. We take out this blood in the capillaries that's often existing within a Western medical context only through osmosis and no longer moving. We take that out. And then the new blood comes in and it repairs the tissue. It's pretty cool. It works. Don't bleed varicose veins. I'll just say it again, just to make sure no one misheard me. We can get blood stagnation due to Qi deficiency as well. Again, same river metaphor. If there's not enough water moving through the river, then things tend to lock down and stagnate. In this case, we're looking at Qi deficiency leading to Qi stagnation, but the most common cause of blood stagnation is Qi stagnation. So anything that causes Qi stagnation can cause blood stagnation. Same idea with blood deficiency. You don't have enough in the river, things get stagnant. With blood deficiency leading to blood stagnation, you tend to see a lot of psychological effects of this. When the blood is involved, it tends to be more, oh my God, I'm sorry, I'm getting 1,000 text messages about something I'm supposed to do later, and I need to just shut this off because this is annoying. Sorry about that. Okay. If the patient has blood stagnation due to blood deficiency, then we have to treat it differently. If the patient has blood stagnation due to Qi stagnation or due to trauma, we move the blood and they're better. If they have blood stagnation because they don't have enough blood, we fix this by building up their blood. We talk to this person about nutrition. We do needling to help build blood. We give them herbs to build blood. But if we just move that stagnation out, then it's just going to re-stagnate and usually get worse. So this is what we see a lot with patients who come in every week to the clinic and get better for 2 days and then come back the next week and it's worse. Often there's underlying deficiency that isn't being addressed. Does this, you guys with me on why that is? Does that make sense? Every time we're moving the Qi and blood, we're draining the person a little bit. It takes energy for their Qi and blood to move. So if their stagnation is due to them not having enough resources, then the act of moving is depleting them further. Make sense? I'm seeing mixed results to that question. I'm seeing some nodding. Okay, we'll go with the nodding. Thank you. Phlegm can be an obstruction. We're going to get to phlegm a little bit later. Phlegm is strange by definition, but it can be an obstruction. It can get in the way of stuff. So one of the things that can cause blood stagnation is phlegm accumulation in the body, which within the Chinese medical system, phlegm can occupy the vessels. We're not talking about the phlegm that you cough up. And we're almost done with blood stagnation, and then we'll probably stop after blood. Got something in the chat. How do you see the difference between spider and varicose veins? Spider veins look like a spider web on the skin. They're very superficial. They're not distended. They're not bulging, and they tend to be multicolored. Varicose veins represent the backflow valves in the veins breaking down, causing what look like tiny vein-shaped sausages that have been packed poorly, bulging out of the skin on the person's leg. They're larger, and if you bleed them, you won't fix them. You'll often make them worse. Varicose veins are usually due to spleen-yang deficiency. We are good at preventing them from continuing to occur, limited on what we can do to treat them, though I've seen them go away on their own. You can Google both to get images of them. Yeah, but spider veins look like spider webs. Okay, the last cause of blood stagnation, and the most common one that we're going to see, especially if you do orthopedics, is injury. You're not generating this internally. This is a miscellaneous cause of disease, right? Injury is a miscellaneous cause of disease. But any impact strong enough to disrupt the patient's wei qi will injure the blood and the vessels and lead to bruising. So why do some people get bruised and other people don't? The most important factor is how much wei qi they have. So all bruises on the body are blood stagnation. When the patient says, I bruise easily, what they're telling you is they're qi deficient and maybe also blood deficient. We treat this first and foremost with topical herbs, and we are good at it. And the book I recommended early in this class, A Tooth from the Tiger's Mouth, will give you all of the recipes. For the people here who have a culinary background, I recommend you start making those recipes now. Some of them have to soak in grain alcohol for 6 to 9 months. Start them now. It's fun. And for blood stasis, we kind of do these two things. We regulate the blood. And when we say regulate the blood, what we mean is we go to the organs that are in charge of managing the blood and we say, do your job. So let's say we have some spleen qi deficiency and then the spleen isn't holding the blood very well. Well, we'll tonify the spleen and we'll maybe help to encourage some movement. But we're asking the body to do its job properly. We're asking the body to regulate the blood that's already there. And that's what we do when there's mild blood stagnation and when there's something off with their organs communicating. On the other hand, we can also invigorate blood, which is where we go in and we move the blood for the person's body. This is often what we're going to do with external herbs for trauma. We're not going to activate the person's natural systems to regulate the blood and get it moving properly. We're going to go in and break it up ourselves. And this is what we tend to do when the blood stagnation is especially bad or when the blood stagnation is the root itself. We actively go in and move the blood. Moxa works well for this, cupping works well for this, gua sha works well for this, and strong needle stimulation works well for this. Okay, it's 12:07, and I think we're going to stop before going into internal wind. And next week, we're going to go over relative versus absolute imbalances. I would love it if you guys would read through those slides that I put up. Just to get a little bit of a baseline because it's a relatively difficult subject to talk about. And we're going to wrap that up and hopefully get through the rest of, at least most of the rest of the internal causes of disease, internal pathogenic factors next week. And we will have a quiz next week. We're not going to talk about any of the internal pathogenic factors. I'd recommend studying them a little bit just to begin getting used to them. We're going to be going over the first 2/3 of this class and a little bit from last week as well. So there are going to be questions on what does anger cause qi to do? What does sadness cause qi to do? I expect you to know all of those. And I expect you, if I were to give you images of wei qi versus xie qi, I expect you to be able to say what you expect to see from the patient. If I just give you one of those bar graphs, I expect you to be able to tell me what you think the results will be. And that's most of it. That sound good?
Sounds good. So we're going to have a quiz on Moodle in the beginning of the class.
You will have a link sent out through email and into the chat here, and then that quiz will be given through Google Forms. So it will not be on Moodle. You will be given a link, you will click it, and you will be able to do it from there. I have deleted all of the quizzes from Moodle. There's no longer anything to take on Moodle exam-wise. It will be administered at the beginning of class, just as we would do if we were in person.
Okay, so we'll do it during the class.
Yeah.
You'll start the class and then we'll start the quiz after we start the class.
Start the class, 5 to 10 minutes for questions, 15 minutes for the quiz.
Okay.
So if you're 5 minutes late, you're not going to miss the quiz, but there's a little bit of time for questions and then we start. Okay? I'll be around for another 5 minutes or so to answer any questions anyone has. I've kind of got to run today, so it's a little shorter than normal. But otherwise, thank you, everybody. good to see you all, and I'll see you next week. Ask me questions in email, ask me questions on the Slack. I've been having some good conversations there. Good to see you all. See you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I actually have a quick question, Peter.
Hey, Amber, is that you? You're breaking up a little bit.
Sorry, hold on.
I can't hear what you're saying.